Paul Taillon from the Policy Insights Forum, and today we have Mr. Garry Clement, who's just written a wonderful book called Undercover: Inside the Shady World of Organized Crime and the RCMP. Garry, if you would be so kind, I would ask that you give yourself a moment to discuss your background, your interest in that area, and your career, what brought you to write this book.
Thank you, Paul, and I'm glad to be here. I started out like most individuals, joined the RCMP in 1973 and went out to British Columbia. But what prompted me to go into the RCMP is I took a very strong view against illicit drugs when I was in grade 12 and joined a group to go with what was very anti-drug, because I had seen what had happened to a couple individuals in the high school. Got out to British Columbia, and I had a very successful career in as much as I was adamant I was going to go into plainclothes. I was adamant I was going to work on transnational organized crime, much to the chagrin of both my trainer and the staff sergeant of the detachment. However, I was successful at 18 months being put into plainclothes and actually running the first drug section ever in Langley. I had a real good rapport with a bunch of individuals that fed me information. So I had drug stat seizures that were unheard of in Langley in previous years. And then I went undercover in 1975. I took the training and went undercover. And that's where I really got to understand organized crime. I got to understand just how prolific it could be in a society and how damaging it could be in a society. I got to see how women were treated as a commodity, and just the harm that drugs like heroin, methamphetamine, and that do within a community. I came back, and pretty well from there, from 1976 right through to 81, I was involved in undercover operations. I did full-time for almost 8 months, I guess, in 1980 to 81 in Vancouver, and was very fortunate that got into the highest echelons of organized crime in British Columbia, tied right back to Catroni and Julian Rivard in Montreal, which are very notable in the book called Canadian Connection by Joseph Charbonneau that was written. That for me was very interesting. That was a time when I witnessed, some of the who's who in the organized crime field, how they operated things as a business, and how they were able to thwart really police activity. And although I thought we were doing it, we had a very large drug section. That's when I think the RCMP actually took federal responsibilities very seriously. But at the same time, I saw how these organized crime groups operated with virtual impunity. And anyways, successful operation. I had to be transferred. There was a threat put on my life and that of my wife. We came back to Ottawa, had to sort of live in the upheaval of a government that had never dealt with a threat on an individual. And to say it was a positive experience would be a lie. It was trying at the very least. But I was very fortunate to have a boss at that time named Rod Stamler. Rod was, as far as I'm concerned, was way ahead of his time. The force would have been well served had he made it to commissioner, because he was really forward thinking. And I can remember one of my first conversations with him was after I'd done a number of preliminary hearings. And I said to him that, what have we achieved? We got our 10 minutes of glory in the media. We're able to flash amount of drugs being seized. But these individuals still have all their money. They're going to go, if they go to prison, they come out, their family's been well taken care of. So really, at the end of the day, what have we achieved? And Rod was very, as I said, very forward thinking. And as a result of that, we started the early proceeds of crime money laundering program. It was at that point that I got really interested, recognized that I need to go back to university. And with Rod's support, I did a part-time and really started working on forming a unit that we could go after the proceeds of crime and money laundering. And I pretty well stayed in that field for the rest of my career, other than 3 years in Hong Kong where I went over and sort of ironic on that because I was asked a year before to do a review of why Hong Kong was not being seen as a positive go-to unit by the Canadian law enforcement. So I did my review, talked to Toronto Metro, Vancouver City, and members of the RCMP, and found out they felt it was nothing more than a drinking hole for the two LOs that were over there. So I believe speaking truth to power, so I wrote a very strong report on it. Had no idea then they were going to turn around and send me over, but what's ironic about that, they left the inspector that I had actually written the report on in place. So you can imagine the reception I got. It wasn't all that positive, but again, as I said, I never get mad, I get even, and I had a job to do and I went and did it. I was very fortunate that I got taken in and was well respected by the Royal Hong Kong Police Triad Bureau. There's a gentleman, he's now since passed away, he was recognized the world leader on triads, a gentleman by the name of Peter Ipao Fook. And Peter took me under his wing, and as a result of it, I was working with Brian McAdam. We put a paper together on describing what triads are and were back then, because it was really interesting. In both Canada and the United States, law enforcement had no clue what triads were. And so we put this general educational manuscript, I guess. Over 10,000 copies went out, so I probably should have made it into a book, but we didn't, because it was for one purpose, and that was educating. Anyway, so long story short, what I found is we had the entrepreneurial program, and all of a sudden, Brian had come to me, Brian McAdam, who has since passed away, but he was probably one of the most dedicated immigration officers that I had ever come across. Believed very strongly in keeping the country safe. And anyway, so he had held approximately probably 50, 60 files of individuals that were trying to get into Canada. So we had, as the RCMP, one of our jobs was to screen them from a criminal perspective. And so what I did is I took all 50, 60 files, put them up in my office, locked them away, and then started going through them. So no immigration officer could approve them while they were in my custody. The first time I went down to the Hong Kong police and asked for background and intelligence on the individuals, it was shocking because their statement was, why would we give it to you? We passed on information in the past and Canada doesn't do anything about it. So we don't want to go the extra mile if you're going to do nothing. And I said, well, you got to give me a chance. You're going to find I'm not the previous. You're going to see I will take very definitive action. And as a result, they opened the doors to me at their Triad Bureau. The amount of information I got was overwhelming and scary, to say the least. These people are hardened criminals. They run networks, and they were getting into our country on the auspices of $100,000 investment. And our immigration officers were letting them in, and the argument was, because I wrote on it, was that at that time, under the Immigration Act, it was not an offense to be a member of a triad society or to hang around with an organized crime group, so it wasn't a prohibitive ground. Well, when I heard that, I couldn't believe that as a country we'd be that naive. So anyways, I knew the immigration bill was up for some changes. I wrote on it to try and get them to put something in the act. And I found out about 3 weeks before it was coming out, nothing had been done. So although it's a shame you have to do this, but I believe sometimes you have to do the right thing at the right time. I met with South China Morning Post. We did a very long article. I became the informant out of Ottawa. Anybody with an ounce of common sense could have realized it was me, but I felt it was the right thing to do. And I'm proud to say we got a change to the act in the 11th hour. And that provided us some grounds to stop these individuals from coming in. Sadly, it was like closing the barn door after the cattle were out, because a lot of them had got in, but we still were able to stop people like the head of the 14K, a guy by the name of Chan Ting Hung. We were able to prevent him from coming in, and a number of others. So it did prove evidence. You would think when I left Hong Kong, that expertise that I had gained and I had gone through the Triad course would be put to use, but I was transferred down to protective operations for a year. I was commissioned officer at that time, and at least I was able to do a review to save some money. And then I got involved with 24 Sussex after the Chrétien incident. Did a review on that. I ended up being one of the first terrorist-trained negotiators for hijackings, et cetera. And as a result, got called in to do the bus hijacking in Parliament Hill. And kind of an ironic anecdote on that, we were very successful. And I ended up going through an internal investigation because I didn't speak French to the individuals outside. I did when we were in a closed area. And I tried to explain to them, you don't get it. Your idea is to slow the tempo down. So the fact that the bus driver had to translate, that was beneficial. And I said the individual himself thought I was a psychologist. So obviously it worked. But no, I still went through a major investigation, and I couldn't believe that the RCMP would not stand up and make a statement. And that really started to show me the politicization of the force. There was other incidents, but that one really hit home. And then, as I said, I pretty well stayed in that field. And then in around 1995, when I was the officer in charge of the Proceeds of Crime Unit, we had an investigation involving a bank called Jefferson National Bank, which was down in Messina, New York. And he had a correspondent relationship with the Royal Bank in Canada. And that was the time at the heyday of smuggling of alcohol and tobacco. And all of a sudden, we were able to put together that between about $600 million came up through Jefferson National Bank by Bring's truck on a regular basis to the Royal Bank on Spark Street. And I could not believe it as we're trying to get, but at that time, the argument was smuggling hadn't been brought in under the Act, even though very senior people in the bank realized it was smuggled money. So we launched an undercover investigation into the Miller organization, who was tied in the Genovese crime family. And they needed an undercover operator that had international experience. And I think the operative word was probably the most important word was older. And so having done a lot of undercover, I agreed to go under again. And fortunately, we were very successful, and we took down the whole organization. Although we laid I would say 95% of the charges, we allowed them to be laid in the United States because our laws in Canada, and I'll get into that a little more, but we are so weak in our laws in Canada that if we can charge in the United States, and you still see it today, that's what the members do, because the chances of conviction, the penalties here, in my view, do nothing to thwart the transnational organized crime activity.
Garry, you alluded to the Chinese as a state actor. What other countries are involved in criminality operations equivalent to the triads, for example, in Canada?
Well, Iran is heavily involved. Russia is involved in a big way. Russia always has been. There's some large criminal elements here. I think if you really look at it, there's a lot of actors in the Middle East that are following what's going on in Canada. But I think the ones we need to be most concerned about is really Iran, Russia, and China at this time. I mean, there's others, don't get me wrong, but there's no way you're going to be able to capture them all at once. But I think if we really concentrate in those three and start to take action, some of the other actors would probably fall off. But they're not going to right now because we're seen as probably one of the weakest links.
Well, in relation to those countries, what are the fields of endeavor for these criminal elements?
Well, I think China is the worst. I dub the Chinese political apparatus as probably the largest transnational organized crime group in history of the world. The activities they're involved in, if you were to really have a look at them and even look at what's in Canada, if you look at the Fentanyl Crisis, they are the provider of all of the precursor drugs. They have formed alliances with the Mexican cartels to finish off the manufacturing. They have stolen our technology for years. That's why they love to invest in our universities and partnerships. In fact, I just read the other day, although we thought the partnerships with the university had stopped, China is still getting patents on various technology that was done through the universities by Canada because of the relationship. We go right back to Nortel, and that was the one where I couldn't believe that government sat, and nobody has, I don't know how you would describe it, but I can't understand, you can't speak truth to power, because the reality of it is that Nortel provided a lot of the technology that Away has used in the past. And the only way to describe it, they were raped and pillaged, and as a result of that company disappeared, which should have been something we were proud of as Canadians. We take a look at other things they're doing. I think the one thing that's the most disturbing, and I don't think Canadians understand this, but the Chinese diaspora here in this country are controlled by the Chinese, and they have lots of agents in this country. We need to have an agent registry and make it illegal if you don't register, because we have so many agents running around in this country untethered, and that includes Russians, that includes the Chinese, that includes Iranians. And we've got to get a handle on it, because I would argue that our democracy is at risk. The elections, the ability to interfere in elections, the money given to various parties. What people don't understand is the whole concept of guangxi in Chinese philosophy, where we look at corruption as something where somebody hands me $100,000 and asks me to do A, B, and C. They'll give you $100,000 to a political party, not ask for anything now, but they expect it down the road. And I had a gentleman that I got to know very well in Hong Kong. His great-grandfather was one of the original tycoons in Hong Kong. And I was out one night, and he was quite an elderly man. He was a Canadian citizen. And anyways, we were in the American Club, and we're sitting there, and he says, "Gary, I want to tell you something." And he said, "Just take this to heart the whole time you're here, and if you're ever involved with dealing with Chinese." And he was Chinese himself. And I said, "What are you talking about?" So he explained guangxi. So he said, if somebody offers you something and they're Chinese, don't take it, because you will pay if you take it. And he says, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I want you to understand that. That's how China works. And he said it is far more ruthless than Hong Kong ever was. And I thought that was very interesting. I've never forgot that. And then I looked at, over the years, I can remember when Mayor Campbell, came over to Hong Kong, and the one thing that always caught me, why don't they ask questions? Why are they not getting briefed? And here he was the next day in the South China Morning Post, raising his hands with the father of the head of the Sanyuan Triad Society. Now, to you and I, if we know nothing about triads, it means nothing. But every Chinese citizen, it begs the question to them, is he in bed with the triads? And it's fully understandable. And those are the things that I think we need to get Canadian politicians understanding. We've had far too many prime ministers that I think initially, maybe for the right reasons, they thought it would be economically viable and beneficial to Canada to have this close relationship with China. Sadly, the opposite is true. There's no doubt in my mind that many of them made a lot of money by their association, personally, by their association with the Chinese. A lot of them worked for the Canadian Chinese Business Association after leaving office. But they were either naive or willfully blind to the impact that was going to have on this country. And that goes right back to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, that used to laud, how Russia was set up. And he lauded how China was set up and how they could manage their people. I think that's a naive view of the world. I think the Chinese probably loved it because they were able to take full advantage of it. And we are paying a price today like never before, and I think it's going to continue. The purchase of our resource industry, the purchase of land in the prairie provinces, that's all going to come back and bite us at some point, and we really now have to start having a serious look at this.
So you alluded earlier to the cost of not combating Chinese and other state organizations in their criminality and influence in Canada. How would you argue within the House of Parliament to deal with this?
Well, I think not dealing with it is going to be the downfall of this country at some point. Maybe not in my generation, but it definitely will be. I think the other thing that we need to look at is and ask ourselves, all of us, both throughout North America, United States as well, what do we want as a country? What do we want our country to look at 100 years from now? Do we want it to be the democracy it is today, or do we want to be, beholden to a regime like China, like Iran? China, I think, is the biggest threat. But and then, if China is supposed to be such a good friend, why haven't they stopped the flow of precursor drugs that are killing our population? Because I do not buy for 1 minute, and I'll give you a good example. When I was over there, we did one of the biggest methamphetamine cases in history. The lab was up in China. Anyways, it was a woman by the name of Li Chaoping. She fled to Canada initially. I went and met with the general up in China, a guy by the name of Lam Fuxing, and the general said to me, "Do you want to interview the individuals who were in the lab?" And I said no, because I knew that there's no rule of law, and God knows what had happened, so why would I interview them? There'd be no value in it. And he said, "Well, I'm telling you, if you want to do it, you have to do it today, because tomorrow we're going to shoot them, and we're going to charge the family for the bullet." I've never forgot that, because that's pretty ruthless. And then when I was working with Pace Law Firm, Sergio Marquis and Jerry Weiner were working with me at the time, both former immigration ministers. Well, Sergio took Al Pace, and I think John Kretchen was there, and they went on an excursion into China. As you know, the Pace Law Firm is big into immigration. And anyways, it was interesting because the person that hosted them was an individual on his way up in the Politburo by the name of Bo Xilai. Bo Xilai, about 2 months later, was the one that got arrested for the harvesting of organs. Mm-hmm. His wife got arrested for killing a British businessman. That shows you the ruthlessness of what we're dealing with in a regime. And he's not alone. And I think that's what we got in there. The Uyghurs are being decimated, and society, the world, says nothing. We say nothing about the travesties. Our politicians in this country are afraid to say something. But we have to start speaking truth to power. Because if we don't, what's going to lie ahead for future generations, I would say, does not bode well. And they're going to look back on us because they're going to see what side of history we're on, and we're going to be dubbed the society or the era that sat back and threw away our country.
In the previous discussions that we've had on the Policy Insights Forum, we had General Robert Spalding, a brilliant military officer and now an academic, who wrote, as you know, Stealth War. But he commented on the Chinese study called Unrestricted Warfare that was written by two full colonels circa 1999. In page 123 or 127, I forget which, there's a paragraph relating to kinetic and non-kinetic operations, in which he basically, in the non-kinetic aspect, talks about finance warfare, information operations, drug warfare, this sort of routine. I kind of was intrigued by this drug warfare, Garry, and so this apparent opioid deaths in Canada between June 2016 and March 2021, we lost about 28,828 Canadians. And if you were late picking up these bodies and taking care of them, the estimated cost was between 456 million and 684 million, which is extraordinary. Because unfortunately, these young Canadians, I would think between the ages of 15 and 34, were essentially drugged to death. But that's an economic issue. There's also an aspect of a moral issue for the Canadian government to deal with that. And then, of course, there's a policing and national security issue because you're destroying the capability for a draft, if you will, a military force. Because right now, it's estimated 80% of young American males are not fit for military service.
Right.
So, extrapolating all that, how do we deal with this massive wave of various types of drugs? Recently, I listened to the Americans talking about using special forces in Mexico with or without Mexican government approval. How do we deal with this, Garry? You're an expert in this area. Do we go by laws? Do we do a coalitional operation? Where do you think we should go with this?
Well, the first one is that I think our politicians have to recognize how serious this problem is. And they like to pontificate on it, but I don't think any of them really sat down and recognized how serious it is. I mean, you added about all the costs, but I would add another one. Try and get into an emergency ward on a Friday or Saturday night in any hospital in Canada, and they are tied up dealing with drug overdoses. And we really now have to get a handle. How do we get a handle on it? Why aren't we pushing back on the Chinese? I do not buy for a minute that the Chinese government could not stop all of these precursor chemicals from leaving the country. We need to start controlling our ports. Our ports are controlled by organized crime, which means we can't control what comes or goes out of this country. That's an absolute shame. We watch all the vehicles that are being stolen. The press has had a field day saying how they get on, stolen one night, they're on a boat the next day out of Montreal. Same thing on the West Coast, or on a boat out of Vancouver ports. But that money's going to pay for Hamas, for instance. That helps pay for that. Why are we not taking this seriously? The other thing we need to do is recognize that we don't have a federal force in this country that's effective anymore. It's a sad state, but I think the Cullen Commission highlighted it. I've been highlighting it for 10 years now and being very vocal on this. Does the RCMP have individuals that have the capacity? Absolutely. But one thing I learned is there is such a huge difference between federal policing and contract policing. It's like being a bookkeeper to an accountant, and that's the best way I can describe it. And we've got to recognize those factors. We've got to recognize that in order to be good in federal policing, we have to build expertise. It does not exist today. I believe, and I'm stand behind this very strongly, the RCMP has been a phenomenal organization for this country up until about 10 years ago. It started to fall apart 10 years ago, and why? We're dealing with complexities like we've never seen before when you're dealing with transnational organized crime. When I started, we didn't have computers, so it was fairly easy. It really was boots on the ground type investigation. It's not that way today. If you can't understand generative AI and all the complexities that come with cybercrime, you can't do a job today in federal policing. And how do you gain that expertise when you're working barking dog complaints in uniform? And I don't mean to undermine it, but that's the reality. So we have to get a handle. And municipal and provincial policing is a responsibility of the province. We don't, yes, it's great to see the red surge and we get all warm and fuzzy about it. And I still today, to put on a red surge, you're still very proud. But the reality is that doesn't solve crime. We need an FBI, DEA type federal police service. We need to look at our laws. We are the joke in a lot of our counterparts. When I was the executive vice president of the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists, I got to travel all through the United States and into Europe, and I met with a lot of law enforcement and a lot of financial business people, fairly senior. We were looked at as an absolute joke. They laughed about our laws and our inadequacy in able to combat organized crime. And it's true. We haven't had a money laundering conviction in this country. And why is that? There's lots of reasons. We haven't been able to accept, and nor has the Bar Association, accept that they're part of the problem. They're a gatekeeper, and without accountants, bankers, and lawyers, money laundering can't exist. And yet we're rampant in this country.
You mentioned money laundering. Could you explain to us, from what my readings were, the Vancouver model?
Yeah, Vancouver model is just essentially essentially what it was is Chinese. They were, in order to get around the exit laws that were in existence in China, they would allow Hawala or Hawaladar, which was a Chinese businessman. As we know, there was a couple businesses cited in that report. Mm-hmm. And essentially what would happen is these Chinese people or gentlemen would come over. They would want $300,000. The Hawaladar would pay it, the $300,000 in Canadian money, so they go gamble in the casino. And that was paid back because it was paid for drugs in China. And so it was all done through Hawaladar, and it looked as though it was very legitimate. The same thing happened when it was for the real estate. Exactly the same situation. It was done through an Hawaladar. You got Mr. Lowe wanting to come into our country. He wants to buy a house. He's got lots of money, but he can't get it out of China. So what's he do? He uses the underground banking system. He comes over here. He meets as a signed contact. They give him the money that is necessary, whether it's through a real estate transaction or otherwise, but he's already paid it back in Chinese currency over in China. So it's just a balancing act, and the percentages are paid. And Canada became prolific for it. We're not the only country, but it just showed up in such volume. And I saw it work when I think it was 1992, we had a kidnapping. And it involved an individual. He was Taiwanese, but he was going to university in British Columbia. He was kidnapped in British Columbia. He was kidnapped by Triads. And so the father, who was a surgeon in Taiwan, was contacted, and he was told he had to pay, the exact amount, it slips my mind, but it was around the $200,000 mark US. And he had to pay it over in Hong Kong. So he sent his brother over, and his brother had a slip of paper, and it had a Chinese character on it. And this was all under surveillance because the Royal Hong Kong Police worked with him. And he went into this nondescript trading center, rundown building, walked out with a briefcase full of $200,000 cash. And that's how the underground banking system works.
Interesting. Well, you alluded earlier as to issues with the RCMP. Considering the national security threats and the evolving complexities that we're facing, in your opinion, is our intelligence, police, and security establishment prepared to combat these multi-level challenges? Essentially, as you pointed out, are we really fit for purpose in a national way to deal with this threat?
Not even close. The first thing that has to happen is a full acknowledgement by our political masters that we are not fit for purpose, and we have to. That means then there has to be a commensurate investment so that the organizations can be fit for purpose. And that's not going to happen overnight. Do we have the skills within these organizations? Yeah, I think for the most part we do. I think they're hidden. I think they're probably handcuffed for the most part. But once we accept it, and our political leaders accept it and openly declare it, would be a good start. But it's going to take years to build up that capacity to do it right.
During your period within the RCMP, do you think that Canadian business and business leaders and business elites have a responsibility to assist national security through moral investments?
I believe we all do. This is our country. This is something we're going to leave behind for generations. And I think there's a moral imperative on the part of business leaders to do what's right. I would like to see our big banks taking a stronger stand than they do, because we know there's still far too much leakage in our banks. And as I said, the one organization that really hit home for me, and that I happen to do a lot of training over the years at Western Union. And if anybody knows the story, Western Union really got hammered by the regulator, rightly so. And I was there when the CEO of the company came out and did an address to his staff. And his address was this: anybody in this company that puts profit ahead of compliance, I will show them the door. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if every bank CEO, every board of director put compliance at the same level? Because I can tell you now it is not. And that's what we have to do. Fortunately, I work for somebody. I wouldn't be working with a bank, but I work for somebody now, like Dave Taylor out of VersaBank, that has that moral imperative. I have shut down, with his agreement, a number of recommended new offerings or new services due to risk. And David puts compliance right at the top, and so does the board. And it's such a refreshing feeling to have somebody. And I think what really shows his support, he got 100% behind my book. I don't know another bank president, because it's not without controversy. It does speak truth to power, but he has stood beside me all the way in writing this book, which I think shows how dedicated and committed he is to having a moral integrity in banking.
Well, recently we've had a number of authors and experts like yourself who've come out to write these books. Everything from, Red Handed by Peter Schwarzer, Shadow War by Jim Scioto, Hidden Hand, as you're well aware, by Clive Hamilton, and Claws of the Panda by Jonathan Manthorpe, and Deceiving the Sky by Bill Gertz, amongst others. Why isn't our leadership, our government, not abiding or taking issue with some of these books and exploring ways of dealing with this national security threat?
Well, I have appeared, and I guess the only way I can explain that, I've appeared before the House of Commons committees in the past. I've appeared before the Senate committee in the past, given them the same message. I'm giving it probably stronger now, but I've given that message out, and for whatever reason, it never seems to be a priority. I hate to say it, but politicians have to forget worrying about being reelected all the time and start doing what we voted them in to do. And unfortunately, especially over the last few years, it's not about what's good for the country. It's about how do I get reelected to stay at the trough. I hate to put it that way, but that's how I feel. I have to admit, as a Canadian, I've never been so disgusted with the way that politics is being run in this country. It's worse in the United States, but it's disgusting that we put nothing for the benefit of this country. It's all about reelected. We've got to get a handle on it. We've got to get our politicians recognizing we can't sit and idly by. And I wrote on the review of the Proceeds of Crime Money Laundering Act. So I was told the other day I'll be called before the House of Commons to testify. And my final conclusion in that paper was, we cannot wait another 5 years to get this right. The clock is ticking, and I believe if we go down another 5 years and do nothing, we will never be able to bring it back.
Garry, if you had an opportunity to address Canadian lawmakers writ large, what 3 initiatives would you provide them to undertake?
Well, the first thing I would do is I would demand that we have a gap analysis, bringing the right expertise to the table, and do a full gap analysis from law enforcement, intelligence, and legislation. And let's look at those gaps, and then let's find a way to overcome those gaps to the best of our ability. And I believe there's people out there that are smart enough, have the will, and I think if we brought the right people to the table, we could do it. But that actually means then that people have to accept truth for power, because it is going to be painful, And I think it's going to be embarrassing. But the sooner we do it, the better we will be off as a country.
And what other two options would you also put forward? Do we need a better, shall we say, linkage between domestic intelligence operations by CSIS, by the CSE, by other organizations that we have, and the RCMP? As you pointed out, you think that we should be more the FBI, more FBI-like. How do you see this interconnection going?
I've always said this, and I said it when I worked and we had intelligence units. Intelligence is only intelligence if it's useful. So having organizations gather information and house it and keep it locked up, who benefits? We need to have combined intelligence units that work together. Not everybody will act on that same intelligence, but everybody's got to be at the table. It's the same argument I use today when it comes to money laundering and banking. We need a better private-public partnership than we've ever had. Why is it a bank kicks out somebody for money laundering and they walk down the street and from Nova Scotia and con the Royal Bank in opening an account? I was involved with one bank that had banked full patch Hells Angels and all their business for a period of 10 years. Now, how does that happen? So we got to start being better at sharing intelligence and working together. The criminals love what we're doing. Transnational criminals love what we're doing. I used to say, when I worked on the bikers, that we were organized policing and they were disorganized criminals. Sadly, today, it's disorganized justice and law enforcement, and it is organized criminals. Look at the Hells Angels. When I started, they were street thugs on the street. They're a transnational organized crime group today in 27, 28 countries. Why did we allow that to happen? We own that. We own that for our next generation. What's that going to mean? Like you said, what's going on with the drugs and the number of people that are dying, and I agree with you. The loss of economic potential to this country scares me. The loss of, right now, I just heard the general come out in Canada talk about not able to get enough soldiers. That's our national security at risk. How are we going to defend this country? A 70-year-old man like myself would be the first to sign up, but they wouldn't take me. But I'm not much value at that age. But that's the part that's scary. We're losing a generation. And I think people have to realize this is serious. It's not a case of, a good analogy, and you probably can understand this. A professor walks into his first day in class and looks out in the auditorium and he points to a third row and says, "What's your name?" The young girl says, "Sally." He said, "Well, Sally, pick your books up and get out of my class." And she looks at him and he said, "I'm serious, get out of my class." She gets up and she walks out. He looks around at the rest. He says, "Do you think that was fair?" And everybody's shaking their head. He said, "But not one of you spoke up because it didn't directly impact you." And that is what's wrong with society today. And I think that is, in fact, true. If it's your child that became a drug addict, you want something done. 17 of your neighbors down the street won't say a thing. We've got to get this to society and make them realize we're in this together. This isn't isolation, but somehow the independence of everybody is what's driving the ability of these organized crime groups to thrive.
Garry, I'd like to thank you for your time. I know you're limited, you've got other engagements, but I must admit this is most insightful. And thank you for writing Undercover, Inside the Shady World of Organized Crime and the RCMP. I wish you all the best in this book, and hopefully you'll do more. We need your information. We need your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you very much. It's been very enjoyable. All the best.